Montana Territory, 1882. The wind bit sharp across the open plains as the stagecoach wheels groaned to a stop outside the weather-worn depot of Dry Willow. Margaret Alden stepped down, her boots crunching against the frost-laced ground. She clutched her small carpet bag tighter, the letter that had brought her here folded too many times to count, worn at the creases like her heart. She was 27 and arriving as someone's last hope, or so she'd thought. The man she was supposed to marry, Everett Palmer, stood at the edge of the platform, hat in hand. He was older, with hollow eyes and two boys flanking his legs, Owen and Oliver, 10 and 8, both staring at her like she was a stranger breaking into their home. "Ma'am," Everett said stiffly, "we expected you last week. I reckon you got delayed." "There was a rock slide near Bozeman," she answered softly. "They had to reroute." He looked her over, not unkindly but not kindly either.
"Well,
best come on then." The ride to his ranch was silent. The land was wide open, the sky bruised with cloud. Margaret sat straight, her fingers white on her bag. When they arrived, the house was tidy but cold. Inside, a woman, Everett's sister, handed her a mug without a smile. "Everett tells me you cannot have children," she said plainly. Margaret blinked. "That is true. I do not think the boys need another mother. They already lost one. Just try not to confuse them." Margaret didn't answer. She had no intention of forcing anything, but the ache in her chest tightened. She spent the next few weeks helping where she could, mending shirts, tending the stove, fixing what was broken. The boys avoided her. Everett barely spoke. At night, she lay on the narrow cot in the pantry, staring at the ceiling. One morning, a horse came up lame, and Everett sent her to town for liniment. She walked the 4 miles, boots muddy, wind in her face. At the general store, she waited behind a tall man with a crooked hat and dust on his shoulders. He turned just as she reached for the same jar of pickled eggs. "After you," he said, stepping back with a small smile. She nodded, too tired to smile back. "You new in Dry Willow?" he asked, his voice easy low.
"Yes," she said.
"Margaret Alden." He shifted the can of beans in his hand. "Travis Cooper." She gave him a polite nod, expecting him to walk away like everyone else. But he just stood there, watching her closely. "You all right?" he asked after pause. She hesitated. "I am fine." He studied her face a moment longer, then tipped his hat.
"Well,
if you ever need anything, I got a place just west of Widow's Ridge. Folks call it Cooper's Rest. Do not ask me why." She managed a whisper of a smile before heading back out into the cold. That night, Everett told her plainly, "This arrangement is not working." She sat quietly at the table, hands folded. "I see. You are not what I expected. I need someone who can raise my boys. Someone who can carry more. I never said I could give you children."
"No.
But I thought maybe something would change." He stood. "I will take you back to town tomorrow. I will tell the Reverend it did not work out." She nodded, heart hollow. There was nothing to fight for. The next morning, she packed her bag. Owen and Oliver barely looked at her. Everett dropped her at the church steps and rode off without a word. Margaret sat on the bench near the bell tower, shivering in her coat, watching the dust blow across the street. No one came near.
No one said goodbye.
She did not cry. By sundown, she was still sitting there, her bag at her feet, when the door to the saloon down the road swung open. Travis Cooper stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. He paused when he saw her. "You been sitting there all day?" She blinked up at him. "I have nowhere to go." He frowned, then walked over and sat beside her, not asking questions. After a moment he said, "Come on. You do not need to sleep on a church bench." She hesitated. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not," he said. "I got room. And nobody to fill it but a stubborn horse and a half-blind dog." She followed him. Cooper's Rest was small and quiet, set between two hills with a porch that looked out over the valley. He showed her the guest room, clean and warm. "You can stay as long as you like," he said, setting her bag down. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Over the next few days, she helped around the place feeding the animals, sewing a rip in his saddlebag, baking bread. Travis never asked questions. He just worked alongside her, quiet and steady. One evening, after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sun drop below the hills. The dogs snored at their feet. "You do not talk much," she said finally. He smiled faintly. "Neither do you." She looked down at her hands. "I was told I would not be enough. For a man. For a family." He turned his head slowly toward her. "Well, that is a lie." She looked at him, surprised. "You are enough, Margaret," he said, voice low but firm. "More than enough." Her throat tightened. He reached out slowly, gave her hand a gentle squeeze. She did not pull away. That night, she cried for the first time in weeks. But not from sorrow, from something else. Something like hope. The morning frost lingered late along the edges of the pasture, clinging to the tall grass like silver thread. Margaret stood just beyond the fence, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, watching as Travis led the bay mare down toward the creek. He moved with an ease she'd come to recognize, not just capable, but patient in a way that made the land seem quieter around him. He returned a while later with damp sleeves and a small branch tucked behind one ear. "Creeks drop some," he said. "Good sign. Might mean less washout come spring." She nodded, brushing a stray hair from her face. "I never thought much about creeks before." "You think about different things when the land feeds you," he said, glancing toward the barn. "You hungry?" "I can fix something," she offered. "We'll do it together." Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of smoke and last night's stew. She chopped onions while he worked the coffee mill, the rhythm between them quiet but companionable. When they sat down to eat, steam curling from their bowls, Travis leaned back and studied her for a long moment. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. She set her spoon down slowly. "You mean here?" He nodded once. "I don't know what I'd be if I did," she said. "I'm not a wife. I'm not a mother." "You're Margaret," he said. "That counts." She looked away, unsure what to do, with the warmth rising behind her ribs. After breakfast, she swept the porch while he repaired a loose hinge on the chicken coop. A hawk circled wide above the western ridge, its shadow gliding over the dry weeds below. The dog barked once at nothing, then settled again beneath the porch railing. Later that afternoon, Travis returned from the shed with 2 oil lamps and a cracked bucket. "You ever mend tin?" he asked. She shook her head. "Only fabric." "Well," he said, placing the bucket between them on the porch steps, "tin don't give as easy, but it don't unravel neither." She watched as he showed her how to heat the soldering iron, how to press the patch firm. Her fingers slipped once, and he caught her wrist before she burned herself. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though she hadn't moved. His hand stayed on hers a moment too long. When he let go, the air between them felt different. That evening, he disappeared into the barn after supper. She found him sitting on an overturned crate, tuning a fiddle that looked older than him by 20 years. "I didn't know you played," she said, stopping just short of the threshold. "I don't really," he said. "Not well. But sometimes it helps the quiet settle." She crossed the threshold and sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "My father played," she said after a while. "He taught my sister. I mostly listened." He drew the bow slow across the strings, coaxing out a wavering note. It wasn't beautiful, but it was honest. "Would you like to try?" he asked, offering the fiddle. She hesitated, then shook her head. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "Same place as anything else," he said. "With trying." She took it. The wood was warm from his hands. She placed it beneath her chin, awkward and unsure. He guided her fingers, his breath close against her temple. The note they made together was thin and trembling, but it held. She didn't sleep that night, not out of unrest, but because something inside her had begun to shift, like thawing earth. The next day, a man arrived on horseback, his coat streaked with trail dust. He carried a rifle slung low and a hard set to his jaw. "Name's Harris," he said, dismounting slowly. "Looking for someone." A woman named Margaret Alden. She stepped forward, heart tightening. "That's me." "I come from Miles City," he said. "Your sister sent me. She's unwell. Asked for you." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. "How bad?" "She didn't say. Just that she needed you." Travis stood beside her, silent. "I can leave at first light," she said. "I'll take you," Travis said, already turning toward the stable. She looked at him then, truly looked. The set of his shoulders, the steadiness in his gaze. She didn't want to leave, not even for family. "I don't know how long I'll be gone," she said softly. "I'll be here," he answered. She nodded, throat tight. The next morning, the sun rose pale and cold behind them as they rode east. Neither of them spoke much, but when they stopped for water near a stand of cottonwoods, Travis reached into his saddlebag and handed her something wrapped in cloth. She opened it to find the fiddle bow, polished and smooth. "In case she remembers the tune," he said. Margaret looked up at him, eyes stinging. He touched the brim of his hat. "You'll come back when you're ready." She nodded, holding the bow to her chest like it was made of something far finer than wood and horsehair. The wind out of the east was colder than Margaret remembered. It carried a knife edge over the flatlands as she rode beside Harris toward Miles City, her scarf pulled high, fingers aching against the reins. They reached the edge of town by dusk on the third day, the sky pale with dust and the streets quiet but for the soft clatter of hooves on packed dirt. Her sister, Clara, was thinner than Margaret recalled. The small boarding house room smelled of liniment and boiled cabbage, and Clara's cheeks bore the hollows of weeks spent in a sickbed. But her eyes lit when she saw Margaret, and for a time, neither of them spoke, just held on. That first night, Margaret sat by the stove while Clara slept. She stitched the fraying hem of her sister's nightdress by lamplight, her thoughts drifting to the hills west of Dry Willow. Travis hadn't sent word, but she hadn't expected him to. Still, she missed the way he listened before speaking, missed the way he made room for her without asking for anything in return. Clara's health wavered like a candle flame. Some days, she was well enough to sit at the window and ask about Montana's ridgelines. Other days, she barely stirred. Margaret did what needed doing, cooked simple meals, refilled the coal scuttle, read aloud old letters tucked in Clara's sewing box. One afternoon, as Margaret folded clean linens, Clara spoke without turning from the window. "Did you love him?" Margaret looked up, startled. "Who?" "The man who sent for you. The rancher." "No," she said after a moment. "He didn't love me either. Not the way you'd hope someone might." Clara nodded slowly, then looked over her shoulder. "But there's someone else." Margaret hesitated. "There's a man who saw me. Not what I could give him, or what I lacked. Just me." Clara's eyes softened. "Then what are you doing here?" "You asked. I didn't expect you to stay. You're my sister." Clara reached for her hand, thin and dry as paper. "So, is he worth it?" Margaret stared down at their joined hands. "He gave me a place when I had none. Never asked for anything back." Clara smiled faintly. "Then go when I'm well enough." It was another full week before Margaret dared think of leaving. Clara had begun walking again, slow and careful, and the town doctor said she'd turn the corner. Margaret packed without rush, folding each garment with care. She left Clara with the boarding house keeper, an older widow named Mrs. Elwell who had known their family years ago, and agreed to look in daily. The ride back was lonelier than she expected. She stopped once to water the mare near a stand of poplars and sat there longer than she meant to, watching the leaves tremble in the wind. Travis hadn't said he'd wait,
but he had said he'd be there.
She reached Cooper's Rest just after sundown. The yard was quiet, smoke curling steady from the chimney. She dismounted slowly, unsure if she should knock. The door opened before she could reach it. He stood there, lantern in hand, his shirt sleeves rolled high and a streak of flour on his forearm. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "You hungry?" She nodded once, throat tight. Inside, the table was set for one. A tin plate, a loaf of brown bread, and a bowl of something steaming. He fetched another plate without a word and set it across from his. As they sat, he poured her coffee and passed the butter. The lamplight flickered low across the wood grain. "You came back," he said finally. "I didn't know if I'd be welcome. I left your things where they were." She looked up. "You thought I might return." "I hoped." They ate slowly, the silence between them no longer heavy, just full. When the meal was done, she stood and began clearing the plates. He reached for one, but she stopped him. "I want to do this part," she said, eyes steady. He let her. Later, on the porch, the stars were beginning to show. He leaned against the railing, arms folded. She stood beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. "I didn't know what I was worth," she said quietly. Not after being handed back, like something unwanted. He didn't look at her. "That man was a fool. I thought maybe it was my fault, that I wasn't enough." He turned then, slow and certain. "You are, without question." She looked at him, the last of the doubt falling away like winter's chill before spring. "I want to stay," she said. He reached for her hand, fingers rough and sure. "Then stay." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Behind them, the dog shifted in its sleep. Somewhere down in the valley, a coyote called once, then fell silent. The stars deepened overhead, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the quiet settle without fear. She'd come west as a promise someone didn't keep. But here, at the edge of the land and the end of the day, she'd found a place that asked nothing and gave everything. And a man who saw her, not for what she could never be, but for everything she already was. The spring thaw came slow, as it always did. Water pooled in the low hollows, softening the earth beneath the fences, and the fields wore a coat of pale green like a promise whispered, too quiet to trust yet. Margaret stood at the line where the grass met the packed path to the barn, holding a basket of laundry still warm from the sun. The wind carried the scent of wet cedar and the faint tang of horses, and somewhere deep in the trees, a woodpecker knocked steadily at the world. Travis walked up from the far pasture with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a streak of dried mud across his collar. He paused when he saw her, brushing a hand against his brow. "Fence post gave way near the back line," he said. "I'll need to dig a new one in tomorrow. Might bring in that neighbor boy for help. He's got strong arms and more time than sense." She smiled and shifted the basket on her hip. "You want me to bring something down for lunch?" He shook his head. "No need. I was thinking you could ride into town instead. Supplies are thinning." "Do you need much?" "Just enough to keep us from living on dry beans and hope." She set the basket on the porch and stepped over the threshold to fetch her shawl. When she returned, he was still standing there, his eyes following the sky like he was measuring something in the clouds. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded once. "Just thinking on the roof. Shingles'll need replacing before summer. Storms hit hard out here when they come." She mounted the mare herself and rode toward town with the sun behind her. The road had dried in places, though a few ruts still whispered of the season past. She passed a wagon stuck along the edge of a shallow ditch, a girl and her father trying to coax the wheel free. Margaret dismounted, without hesitation. "Lift from the back while I wedge this under," she said, kneeling beside the wheel with a flat stone. The man gave her a curious glance. "You done this before?"
Once.
"Maybe twice." With a push and a grunt, they freed the wheel. The girl clapped her hands, and Margaret dusted her palms against her skirt. "You live near?" the man asked. "With a man west of Widow's Ridge." He raised a brow. "That Cooper place?" She nodded.
He tipped his hat.
"He's a quiet one, but folks say good things." Margaret didn't answer, just gathered her reins and rode on. In town, the mercantile smelled of flour and oiled wood. She greeted the shopkeep, an older woman named Ruth, who kept a chalkboard behind the counter with names and tallies. Margaret handed over the list Travis had given her and wandered toward the bolts of cloth while Ruth filled the order. She ran her fingers over a length of calico the color of faded foxglove, soft and fine, and thought of the curtain above his kitchen window, how it hung just a little too short. "You ought to have that one," Ruth said from behind her. "Would brighten a place." Margaret turned the fabric over in her hand. "I was thinking the same." Back at Cooper's Rest, dusk had settled low. She found Travis in the lean-to behind the barn, sharpening a draw knife with slow, practiced strokes. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes dropped to the fabric bundle in her arms. "That for a new dress?" he asked. "No," she said, setting it on the porch rail. "For the window. It's always bothered me that it sags." He smiled, faint and real. "I never noticed." "I did." She went inside and began piecing the curtain without waiting for permission. He joined her some time later, drying his hands on a cloth, and stood watching her thread the needle by lamplight. "I saw a wagon stuck along the road," she said. "Help them out." "You always step in like that." "If someone's waiting for help, I can't seem to walk past." He nodded slowly. "That's a good way to be." She looked up. "You think so?" "I do. Though it'll wear you thin if you're not careful." She set the needle down. "I'm not afraid of being worn, just afraid of being useless." His brow furrowed. "You've never been that." The lamp flickered, and the dog shifted near the hearth. Margaret folded the curtain in her lap and looked toward the front room. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. Travis leaned against the doorframe. "I think about the barn roof, the fence line. Sometimes I think about planting more corn this year." And sometimes he paused, then met her eyes. "I think about you, still here come winter." She rose slowly, cloth still in hand, and crossed to him. "I think about that too." He reached for her hand, not rushed. "You sure?" "I stayed," she said. "Not because I had nowhere else, but because I wanted to." Their hands stayed joined, quiet between them. The room held still, not waiting, just watching. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere far off, a spring storm was gathering, but it would pass. The roof would hold. The fields would rise green again. And inside that house, a place had been made, stitched not by need, but by choice. By two people who saw each other clearly and stayed. The last frost passed without ceremony. One morning, the water troughs stayed clear, and the wind no longer held ice in its breath. Travis stood in the orchard behind the house, sleeves rolled to the elbow, tapping gently at the bark of a young apple tree. Margaret watched from the kitchen door, wiping her hands on the edge of her apron, a damp cloth still warm from drying the crockery. "You think they'll bear this year?" she asked. He turned, squinting against the sun. "If the bees show up proper. Last year they barely touched these rows. I could ask Mrs. Langford for the honeycomb frames again. She offered last week. She's still keeping bees in that dry patch behind her smokehouse."
"She is."
"Says she talks to them when nobody's around." He gave a soft sound that could have been agreement or amusement, and turned back to the tree, his hand steady at the trunk. Later, while Travis mended the wheelbarrow axle near the barn, Margaret took to the storeroom and began sorting through the bolts of old cloth, buttons, and jars of preserved peaches that hadn't been touched since winter. Tucked behind a crate, she found a length of muslin she didn't remember placing there. She measured it against her arm and thought of something she hadn't let herself imagine before: a dress made not for practicality, but for standing still beside someone who wanted to look at her. That evening, she laid the muslin out on the table. Travis came in with the scent of hay on his coat and paused, seeing the fabric spread like a map. "You making something?" he asked. "I think so," she said. "Haven't stitched for myself in a long while." He stepped closer, fingertips grazing the edge of the cloth. "You'll wear it well." She met his gaze across the table. "I want to make something for you too. Something that's yours. I've got shirts." "I don't mean a shirt. I mean something lasting." He didn't speak right away. Then, "I've been thinking on building out the back room. Taking down that wall, letting more light in. Could make it into a place for sewing, reading, whatever you wanted." Her hands stilled.
Why?
"Because you're not passing through, and you shouldn't have to tuck yourself into corners." She folded the muslin slowly. "Then I'll help move the wall." By early June, the back room was half torn down. They worked side by side, Travis with the mallet, Margaret with a crowbar, both sweating and laughing as the wall gave way to open air and promise. The dog nosed through the fallen boards while a pair of mourning doves built a nest just under the porch eave. One afternoon, after hours spent planing the new window frame, Travis paused and leaned against the sill, sawdust clinging to his sleeves. "You ever miss the life you had?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "There was nothing in it I'd go back for. No one waiting. No one who ever really saw me. Not like this." He turned to her, holding her gaze. "I've never wanted to ask a thing you weren't ready to give. But if I said I wanted you to stay as my wife, would that be asking too much?" She stepped forward, her fingers settling gently in the crook of his arm. "You wouldn't be asking anything I haven't already chosen." They married under the cottonwoods behind the house, where the ground sloped gentle and the breeze stirred just enough to carry the scent of lilac. No preacher, just Ruth from the mercantile and Mrs. Langford with her bees, and the two of them standing hand in hand beneath a sky the color of cornflower. Travis wore his best shirt, the one with the mended cuff. Margaret wore the muslin dress she'd sewn with her own hands, the hem stitched with tiny blue thread in the shape of a single row of wildflowers. Afterward, they served coffee and fresh bread on the porch. No speeches, no music. Just the sound of the trees and the murmur of people who'd come to witness something quiet and sure. That evening, when the guests had gone and the light turned honey gold across the ridge, Margaret stood barefoot in the doorway of their room, no longer the guest room, but theirs. Travis knelt beside the bed, folding the quilt she'd chosen from Clara's chest, one she'd brought back with her on her last visit. "I never knew what peace looked like," she said softly. He stood and crossed to her. "For me, it looks like you right now." She rested her head against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat grounding her in a way nothing else ever had. "I want us to build something," she murmured. "Not just a home. A whole life."
"We already are," he said.
Years passed. The orchard bore fruit. The bees came back, thick and humming. The back room filled with bolts of cloth, books, and the muffled laughter of shared mornings. They never had children, but the house was never empty. Neighbors came and went, fires were shared, sorrows eased, and quiet joys found in the folds of ordinary days. Margaret wrote letters to Clara, who eventually moved west herself, settling in a small house near the river, close enough for Sunday visits. The boys from Everett's ranch grew tall and left for their own lives. Margaret heard from them once, a letter from Owen on paper smudged with ink, thanking her for kindness he hadn't understood at the time. Travis built a bench beneath the cottonwoods, and every spring, they sat there with coffee, watching the orchard bloom white and wild. They never spoke of what they didn't have, only of what they'd built with their hands, their patience, and the deep, abiding love that had grown not out of longing, but out of seeing and staying. And in the quiet warmth of each day's end, the wind gentle through the trees, they knew they had come home. Together.